Started with a big sniffle. Still recovering, but doing a lot better this week. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Big thanks if you're joining us again this week. We got a special one for you today. But before we dive into our weekly scheduled programming, my name, if you haven't joined before, it's Jason Brand. I am the Director of Outreach and Partner Development here at Supply Chain Solutions. We refer to ourselves as SCS. So if you hear me say SCS on this show, anytime today, in the future, whatnot, we're talking about supply chain solutions. So if you haven't heard of us, we are a full service logistics partner. Our goal is to provide end-to-end transportation. That includes everything from customs, inventory management, data management as well. And we do all of that on a series of interconnected technology that essentially makes it very easy for you to see exactly what's going on 24/7 and make changes to your network if you need to. Obviously, we bring our experience, but it's your product, so you need to have control. If you haven't used a system or a style of shipping like this, we call it an integrated solution, and we consider ourselves an integrated solutions provider. So you should really consider it this year. We've had obviously more than a few disruptions, and it has been challenging for some people in general, to say the very least. So reach out to us, reach out to our team. We can kind of give you a walkthrough of how our system works and how it differs from a conventional system. It's pretty cool. It really puts a lot of power at your fingertips, and it helps the document flow and information flow between our teams, really streamlining any scheduling between links in the chain. Can save you a ton of money just when it comes to scheduling problems or yada, yada, yada. And obviously a ton of your team's time. So reach out to us when you can. But today, I want to dive right into it. We've got a big show. In honor of Earth Day, we're going to be talking about sustainability and logistics and what's happening in the industry today and how it is affecting you. So literally, with no ado, dive right in. The biggest piece of shipping legislation that has happened recently, and you, your customers, and everyone really, especially anybody who's ocean shipping, is definitely getting affected by it. It happened back in 2023, and that was with the IMO's CEE index. So 2023 was the year of monitoring. That's after this index came out. The goal was to watch these vessels, determine their carbon consumption, and then in 2024, they'd have grades assigned to those vessels and fees associated with the performance of those vessels. Now, we have done a whole ship show breaking this down, and I'm not going to dive into that today, while I will dive into this in the future because there's been a lot of things changing on that account. But you really need to understand that, because that IMO legislation, the CE index and the preceding IMO legislation is really the framework for how future carbon use is going to be punishing, either shippers or the logistics providers and whatnot. Very important to know. But what we really need to get focused on is what's happening in the policy world, what's going to be changing, what are the big things happening right now in the sustainability arena. Now, I got to warn you in advance, this arena itself, it's a very policy-focused arena, obviously. And whenever we talk about policy, we are stepping directly into the hornet's nest of biases and all of these sorts of problems. Fact and fiction can get extremely blurry, ulterior motives, underlying, it's just a mess, okay? So just take what I'm saying today with a grain of salt. Understand we're going to be trying to present as many solid facts as we know, but, at the same time, some of these things are evolving, and sometimes the information you have turns out later to be incorrect or incomplete. So let's dive in right now. The WSC stands for the World Shipping Council. They are pushing very hard to reform the latest IMO legislation. And mainly their goal here, and by there, I mean the WSC, they're focused on building a pricing mechanism, or they want the IMO to be focused on building a pricing mechanism that's going to help balance the cost of these traditional fuels used in the ocean vessels with these new biofuel alternatives, these low carbon biofuels. So why is this happening? Why does the WSC care? So the bottom line is that ocean liners, they're about to be hit with some serious, huge fines. And they've got to figure out a way to level the playing field to appropriately dodge some of these fines or hand them off in an equal way to their customers. Now, the important thing to note here, you're going to hear about the organization WSC if you're watching the news or if you're running through some articles related to logistics and shipping and things like that. And whenever you hear the word WSC, you need to realize what they are. And they are essentially the group of the largest shipping liners, and they're a lobbying organization, and they come together for the goal of policy change. So right off of their, it's actually not off of their website, partially off their website, partially off some other locations. The group members, they collectively operate more than 90% of the total global shipping capacity. The council was established to provide a coordinated voice for the liners and also in their interactions with regulators, policymakers, and other stakeholders worldwide. Now, the dilemma many of the individual members have cited outside of their role as a WSC board member has been the price difference between these green fuels and regular fuels. And it's true. I mean, it's a very, very valid concern here. Biofuels cost roughly $700 more per ton than fossil fuel. So I love this example, but if you took your freight rates between Asia and the US West Coast and you were using a biofuel, let's say exclusively biofuels for the whole shipment, that cost would be roughly $210 more per TEU for just that one transit. And that adds up extremely quick, especially when you're considering these new super large vessels that a lot of these liners are purchasing or they're coming into circulation. Now, that being said, while that cost is there and that cost difference is very significant, the adoption of biofuels based on a couple research studies seems to be very in line with how well each of these ocean shipping liners market their service. Now, Maersk, it's actually a great example. They reported a 37% increase in the use of these low emission biofuels based on their products that they were marketing. They moved roughly 660,000 TEUs. Don't you love it when a bug decides to just get involved? They moved roughly 660,000 TEUs, and that equates to approximately 3% of their total annual volume. Now, if you contrast this with Hapag-Lloyd's similar product, Ship Green, it's also their biofuel product, they only saw 1% of their annual volume moved by it in 2023. Now, obviously, these adoption rates are extremely low at this point, but Maersk has made it a point to comment that this accelerated shift, right, the 34% increase, they're still seeing that into 2024. They're seeing that acceleration continue. And also, they went on to say that nearly 60% of their top 200 customers have committed to them to achieving a net zero ocean emission through using these fuel alternatives. And that's critical, right? Because how do you have a vessel that has partially biofuel users and partially regular fuel users, and how do you equate that cost? You really want to have that vessel being entirely biofuel if possible, and you need adoption to do that. So they have been marketing very well. They've been trying to make this happen, which is great. Now, the IMO is making it pretty clear, and this is really in response to the WSC. You can tell that they actually made some progress in there, to say the very least. But they've got a group. It's called the Maritime Environmental Protection Committee, also known as, you might hear this, but you're probably going to forget this one, MEPC 81. And currently, they're working on establishing that global pricing mechanism. And their goal is to have legislature out and ready to be voted upon in 2027. And that's going to address the cost disparities between these fuel sources. So let's kind of dial it back a little bit. Part of the reason why the WSC is pushing so hard for these fuel pricing mechanism is a lot of their pandemic fueled ship orders. I mean, remember how much it was to ship a container. And as a result, we saw this massive boom in buying ships. Well, a lot of these new ships that were purchased were more expensive ships, and they were specifically designed to run multiple fuel types. So let's take a breakdown of this, because this is actually incredibly crazy, the shift. If you look prior to the pandemic, roughly, and I'm honestly spitballing here, but I was looking at the data, so this is relatively accurate, 90 to 95%, all the way up to 99% of the vessels being purchased were single fuel type vessels. Now, that's the years prior, not a single year, the years prior. We hit the pandemic, right? They start making all of this cash and they start buying vessels. What we saw was in 2021, of the 3.5 million TEUs of capacity that was purchased, 2021, 30% of that was dual fuel. That's crazy. It's a huge increase. And then we go to the next year, 2022, 2.5 million more TEUs of capacity were purchased in 2022, and 60% of that was dual fuel. And then we can move forward again, 2023. Obviously, these really expensive, shipping rates by this point are heavily subsided. So the purchasing is also going down as well. And obviously, we had an oversupply, so there was a lot of concerns there. But still, 2023, 1.7 million TEUs of capacity was purchased, and 90% of that capacity was dual fuel. And all of these dual fuel ships are much more expensive. And now there's a situation where the fuel itself is obviously much more expensive, and adoption rates are still very, very low. So having this pricing mechanism in place is going to really help them utilize these dual fuel ships that cost more and help them dodge some of these carbon emission regulations that are coming out of the IMO. So, you really do see the motivation behind the WSC and what they're really pushing for. And their main target here is they want a lot of change happening in this realm. Obviously, 2027 was the date that was put out there, but their goal is this next term between 2024 and 2029. They want to see a lot of change and essentially refreshing that IMO carbon initiative to, better align with their goals. Let's just say it how it is. Now, this is not actually only happening in the transportation shipping lines, though, and it's not the only companies kind of pushing or scoping this change. You've got Apple. It's a great example because they have really been doing some incredible stuff. They have reduced their scope 1, their scope 2, and their scope 3 carbon emissions by over 55% since 2015, and that is not counting carbon offsets. Now, this is according to a 2023 environmental report. Now, it's also a great moment to clarify what the difference is between carbon offsets and insetting, the difference between those two. And it's also important because it's a big change that's happening in the sustainability realm. So there's been a switch in style from companies primarily using offset style, which is, well, I'll get into that in a minute, but it's essentially like carbon emissions trading, to inset style, like lowering carbon fuel source use. And that's essentially the difference, right? Offsetting involves compensating CO2 emissions generated by a company by investing in projects that reduce the equivalent amount of carbon from the atmosphere elsewhere, right? Insetting, on the other hand, it involves integrating those carbon reduction projects directly into that company's own supply chain or that company's own operations. So, I think the main talk is one is inherently better than the other, but that's really not the case. There is an advantage to offsetting, and that is that, some global CO2 reduction projects just would not have the financing to be able to operate if it wasn't for, offsetting, if it wasn't for the carbon credit market. Now, on the flip side, the main complaint of offsetting is a lot of people say it can be used by companies to simply buy their way out if you don't have any insetting activities to kind of balance the future growth in the area. A lot of this can just be used as a new overhead for doing business in certain industries, right? So once you have a combination of insetting and offsetting, now there needs to be gradual improvement in order to, just make it so offsetting it's not going to be effective going into the future in competition with insetting companies. Now, I say all this because when we go back to Apple's 55% reduction in scope 1, 2, and 3, that was entirely due to insetting measures. That wasn't even including any of the additional offsets that the company purchased. And that's pretty wild. So despite all of those operational changes and all of that investment that is required to make those operational changes, they still, between 2015 and 2022, saw a 64% increase in their revenue. So I kind of want to end on this note. My question really is, what is the value prop for your company to make changes to your operations to reduce your carbon impact? And, I can tell you right now, I can really tell you an important one right now, just being tethered to the global energy markets and our conflicts we have currently in the Middle East and Russia, they should be considered a huge business risk for anybody shipping. Now, the question is, how do we combat that? And how do our investments in today's carbon emissions also achieve the goal of more bottom line revenue in the years ahead? I know this is going to be such a different value prop for each industry, and I'm really curious to hear, how those insetting goals do relate to, better revenue in the future for each industry. So please reach out to me. You can just send me a message on LinkedIn, or you can shoot me an email. I'd love to hear more. So We want to make this nice and quick. That is our sustainability show. It is some important things coming up specifically, right? 2027, huge pricing mechanism likely going to be implemented that will directly affect your cost of shipping. Obviously, we have some stability coming to the shipping market, but just to have a quick one-liner about the state of shipping right now, this is not the year for stability in ocean shipping, unfortunately. It is getting more stable, but we can talk about this a little bit more next week on a freight market roundup. But as we look forward, right, as we get more stability, the just market in general will find the right price. That being said, the cost of fuel will be increasing given these legislation initiatives happening right now. So keep that in mind. Thank you all so much. Very excited for your messages. Shoot me a message. I want to know what your company's doing, and we will talk again soon.